The following is a presentation of New Worker Radio. The views and opinions expressed therein do not necessarily represent those of WZML, its staff, or management.
Hello, and welcome to New Worker News on WZML 92.9. My name is Manolis, bringing you national and international updates from a worker's perspective.
Today's episode, we begin with a historical reflection on the life and work of John Reed, the American communist. John Reed gave a faithful and vivid depiction of events that were of immense importance to the world. His work will forever remain the best book on the October Revolution. These are the words written by Vladimir Lenin to remember the giant of the U.S. communist movement, John Reed. On October 19, 1920, in a Moscow cemetery next to the Kremlin walls, an American, a Harvard graduate, was buried among the heroes of the October Revolution. His name was John Reed. He was only 33 years old, but he had already managed to record, with the insight of a martyr and the fire of a revolutionary, an event that changed the 20th century. His work, 10 Days That Shook the World, in 1919, was not just journalism, it was the living heart of history. Before that, however, in 1914, he published another book, Insurgent Mexico, supporting the revolutionary struggle of the Mexican people and condemning U.S. interference in the country's internal affairs. In 1916, he published the book The War in Eastern Europe, in which he exposed the imperialist character of the war. As a war correspondent in August 1917, he went to Russia, met Lenin several times, became associated with the Bolsheviks, and warmly welcomed the October Revolution. His book gained worldwide fame and was highly appreciated by Lenin, who also wrote the introduction. Reed wrote not as an observer, but as a participant. He was present in the street battles of Petrograd, in the Soviets when power changed hands, and in the factories where the proletarian first raised his head to power. But what made his book immortal was not only its objectivity, its detailed description of events, and its collection of documents, but its dedication to the truth of the order. Reed believed deeply in the case he was describing, which is why he was able to record it with such precision, clarity, passion, and rhythm. 10 Days That Shook the World is not a simple historical narrative. It is the recording of that great moment when the people became aware of themselves and their role. Reed shows how workers and soldiers, women, sailors, and farmers were transformed from an amorphous mass into an active historical subject. Through the turmoil, the conflicts, the contradictions, he records the emergence of a pure but majestic image, the image of the people taking power into their own hands, as a right won with toil, blood, bravery, and awareness. Reed's strength is anthropology. He writes about people learning to stand up. He said, quote, "The Bolsheviks, in my opinion, are not only a force for destruction, but the only party in Russia that has a creative program and enough power to carry it out. Whatever others may think of Bolshevism, the Russian Revolution is indisputably one of the greatest events in the history of mankind, and the rise of the Bolsheviks to power an event of world significance." End quote. This book of his must be read again and again by the workers of all countries, by all of us, because within its pages one will not encounter a utopia, but the real process of emancipation of the workers. He sees how the proletarian revolution was not born out of violence, but of necessity. It was not a coup, but a historical law. He understands that history is not written by leaders or individuals, but by classes that realize their power. In an era like ours, when information has turned into noise, John Reed reminds us of what journalism means as an act of responsibility. He did not cover the revolution. He lived it with his own life, with his own body. He didn't sign responses. He signed his testimony with his own life. Today's multi-thematic journalists of televised windows and algorithms seem like poor relatives in front of the one who took the risk of standing before history, not as a spectator, but as a participant. His important work acquires new relevance in an era of wars, poverty, and social disintegration, where the worker once again becomes a number and truth is replaced by the equalization of opinions. If Reed were alive today, He would not choose to write about events, but mainly about causes. Reed wasn't just a good reporter, he was a poet of action, a passionate revolutionary, a communist who understood the meaning of events and the great struggle. That is why he belongs in the same category as those who believed that journalism could be a form of revolution. In fact, recounting the story of those days, he said in 1919, quote, "I tried to present the events with the eye of a conscientious chronicler who is interested in conveying the truth," end quote. Lenin's phrase, which characterized his book as a, quote, "faithful and brilliant depiction of events," was not a compliment. It was an acknowledgement of the historical responsibility of Reed's writing. For workers all over the world, reading the book of Reed is a lesson in class memory. For young journalists, it is a reminder of ethics, namely that speech only has meaning when it serves the truth. And for all of us, the epic he wrote is a reminder that the unjust world changes not by what is written about it, but when it is written by those who decide to change it. In another story, we look at loneliness in capitalism, when the market eats alive all of our relationships. A new study by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, confirms what many have been feeling for a long time. In wealthy, industrialized countries like the United States, loneliness is spreading like a social epidemic. Young people and the elderly are particularly affected. Among 16 to 24-year-olds, the proportion of those who are in daily contact with friends fell from 44 to 36% between 2015 and 2022. Among those over 65, the proportion who reported never meeting friends rose to over 11%. The pandemic has accelerated this trend, says the OECD, but did not cause it. The causes lie in capitalist society itself. Capitalism is based on competition and isolation. Our lives are entirely transformed into commodities. Our time is divided into work and leisure, and our social relationships are subordinated to the logic of exploitation. Anyone who doesn't perform is quickly discarded as useless, whether it's a young person without a job or a retiree without purchasing power. In this order of things, community is not an end but a means. Friendships and family ties are under pressure from working hours, spatial mobility, and precariousness. People move around for work, live in one-room apartments, change their place of residence, or change their employment. The figures of the study show that young people in particular are losing their social ties. They are growing up in a world where everyone is competing against each other for university places, internships, and jobs. Leisure time becomes about self-optimization, not about meeting people. Even friendships become competition. Those who are more successful, more attractive, more productive are considered more valuable. Constant accessibility via social media does not replace closeness. On the contrary, it creates a feeling of being constantly alone while comparing and measuring oneself to others and their success. Older people also experience the effects of capitalist rationalization. Those who are no longer, quote, productive become socially invisible. Care, support, and social participation are privatized or underfunded. The pandemic didn't create this trend, but rather exposed and exacerbated it. It demonstrated how tenuous the social fabric had become. Those without economic or familial security fell into isolation. Retreating into the private sphere became a responsibility, while caregivers were overburdened and young people were locked away. Loneliness is not an individual failure, not a mental weakness, but a collective symptom of the social conditions in which we live. It shows that a society that turns everything into a commodity, work, housing, education, time, relationships, is destroying its human, its social foundation. In our next few national stories, we will take a look at U.S. protests that took place over the past weekend, the destruction of the environment by the monopolies, a historic labor victory in the South, an overview of the labor movement in the U.S., and the state of older, poorer Americans. On October 18th, large demonstrations against the Trump administration took place in hundreds of cities in the United States, such as New York, Washington, Chicago, Miami, Los Angeles, etc., in yet another confirmation of the intensification of contradictions and popular problems in the U.S., but also of the attempt to trap popular indignation into the channels of the confrontation between the two major poles of the American bourgeois political system, that is, the Democrats and the Republicans. Characteristically, the umbrella organization, so-called No Kings, that organized the protest, announced that approximately 7 million people took to the streets, defending the fundamental principles of the U.S., supposedly those of democracy and freedom. The inhuman treatment of migrants, many of whom have been living in the U.S. for years, by Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) officers, the deployment of the National Guard and military forces in major cities with Democratic governors under the pretext of rising crime, as well as the layoff of thousands of civil servants and cuts to public spending by the federal government, were some of the issues raised in the protests. All of these issues fit nicely within the conditions of intense fighting between the two major bourgeois parties, especially around issues of control over the mechanisms of the bourgeois state, against the backdrop of the difficulties in the capitalist economy and the battle for primacy in the imperialist system, where sections of American capital establish their hierarchies. The No Kings protest is the second to take place in the U.S. since last June, and took place amid the government shutdown in the U.S., which has now entered its fourth week. A first tangible imprint of these mobilizations in the Democratic-Republican conflict is expected to be recorded in next month's local elections on November 4th, with the most important ones being the election of new governors in Virginia and New Jersey and a new mayor in New York. This conflict is expected to continue in the midterm parliamentary elections in November 2026. For his part, President Trump stated that, quote, "They call me king, but I'm not a king." However, a video he uploaded to his personal account shows him piloting a fighter jet wearing a crown that drops feces on protesters. Other government officials, such as Minister Pam Bondi, tried to portray the protesters as Antifa-funded. A federal court in the U.S. has overturned a state law that banned the release of radioactive water from the decommissioned Indian Point nuclear plant located 40 miles north of New York. The decision paves the way for the company Holtec International to release over 170 tons of tritium-containing water directly into the Hudson River. This was reported by Reuters. The law was passed in 2023 after protests from residents and environmental groups who warned that tritium cannot be filtered out and that the substance can accumulate in fish and ecosystems. Despite this, the judge chose to side with the company, arguing that federal nuclear safety regulations override state environmental laws. Holtec, which is responsible for dismantling Indian Point, argued that the state's ban would delay the work until 2041 and increase costs. The decision means the company can now continue the process according to its own timetable, without taking into account the protests of the local community. Environmental group Riverkeeper calls the decision a, quote, capitulation to corporate interests, and demands that the waste be stored on the site for at least 12 years until safer technologies are available to remove tritium. Similar releases from the plant have occurred before. In 2016, a 65,000% increase in tritium levels was measured in the groundwater around the nuclear power plant. The Indian Point case shows the true face of the capitalist state. When profit is against life, the legal system will always choose profit. It is no longer a question of so-called misjudgments or decisions that need to be balanced, but of a systematic disregard for the safety of people and nature. Instead of using science and technology for the good of humanity, under capitalism, they are used to accelerate the destruction of the environment and shift the risks onto the working class. The Hudson River thus becomes yet another reminder that the bourgeois state does not protect the people, but the waste of capital. In the next two stories, we look at recent national U.S. labor news.
We'll be right back with more of New Worker News here on 92.9 FM WZML. But I want to remind you that every day throughout this country, workers are subjected to injustices and humiliation at the hands of the capitalists, from unpaid wages to mass layoffs. So we at New Worker understand the tyranny that the workplace is for workers. This is why we fight to expose these injustices. Only through militant organization of the working class can we stand toe-to-toe against the bosses. So this is why we want to hear from you, the listener. Are you having issues at work? Bosses cutting your hours or wages? Are you or your fellow workers' safety being thrown out of the window in the name of ever-increasing profit? Well, you are not alone. So reach out to us to tell your story. You can anonymously send an email or even a voice memo to cwpusa@protonmail.com. Again, that is cwpusa@protonmail.com. And check us out online at newworker.us. And now back to New Worker Radio, only here on 92.9 FM, WZML.
After 40 days of strike action, employees at the Hilton Americas Houston in Texas have won a historic victory. Through their union, Unite Here Local 23, the workers have signed a new 3-year contract that includes an immediate increase in the minimum wage from $16.50 to $20 per hour, and a further increase to $22 per hour before the end of the contract. The strike, which began in early September, was the first hotel strike in Texas history. Among the strikers were cleaners, laundry workers, and kitchen staff, groups that have long worked under pressure and low wages despite record profits for the hotel in 2023 and 2024. The owner, Houston First Corporation, was forced to give in to the demands after weeks of negotiations. The workers said that for many years they had barely managed to cover their living expenses while the hotel chain increased its profits. The victory in Houston is more than a local success. It is a reminder of the collective power of the working class. In the heart of capitalism's stronghold, where every working day counts in profit and exploitation, these hotel workers are showing that no company is too big to face the organizing of workers. Every such victory, regardless of country, is a blow to the bourgeois ideology that tries to convince workers that we are all alone. The struggle in Houston echoes the same truth that Marx formulated 150 years ago. That is, quote, the emancipation of the working class must be its own work, end quote. And in that, the work of the workers of the U.S. have the CWP USA at their side. While we celebrate the victory of unions, we must also make a sober analysis of the landscape of the labor movement in our country, which remains at historic lows. The percentage of American workers who are members of unions has fallen to 9.9%, the lowest level in more than 40 years, according to recent figures from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. To put that into perspective, in 1983, 1 in 5 workers was unionized. Today, only 1 in 10. The development is raising concerns among researchers and activists who see it as a direct threat to working class rights and a central cause of the widening economic gap in the United States. The difference between sectors is dramatic. In the public sector, 35% are organized, while in the private sector, only 5.9%. Employers, as we know, use legal loopholes, threats, and privatization to prevent unionization, a practice that has become the norm since the 1980s. The decline of the American labor movement coincides with the triumph of capitalism over its former opponents. Since the 1970s, finance capital, through deindustrialization and deregulation, has crushed the collective power of the working class. At the same time, profits have soared while real wages have stagnated. In states where unions are still strong, wages are on average 18% higher and working conditions are significantly better. But the trend is clear. Capital has succeeded in dividing workers, replacing permanent jobs with temporary contracts, and using the legal system as a weapon against collective struggle. The U.S. ruling class talks about freedom in the labor market, but what it means is the freedom to exploit without resistance. The real task for the American working classes, therefore, will be to rebuild their collective strength, not through compromise, not through dialogue, but through class-conscious organization and the revival of a movement that sees itself not just as wage earners, but as the revolutionary force of history. In other national labor news, older Americans with low incomes live on average 9 years shorter than their wealthier compatriots, according to a new report from the National Council on Aging and the University of Massachusetts. The study, which included 10,000 households between 2018 and 2022, shows a clear link between income level and risk of death. Among people with over 60 with an annual income of around $60,000, the 4-year mortality rate was 15%, while among those earning over $120,000, it was 11%. The figures reflect a deep social injustice. Nearly 80% of American retirees have little or no financial resources. Many live on the brink of starvation, forced to choose between food, rent, and essential medicine. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, poverty among retirees last year was 15%, the highest rate of any age group. Behind the numbers lies the true face of American capitalism, a system where life expectancy is determined not by medical advances, but by class and our wallets. Capitalism has created a form of social Darwinism where the poor no longer die in factories, but slowly from loneliness, debt, and lack of care. The American ruling class likes to talk about freedom and opportunity, but for the working class, freedom means choosing between dying of hunger or of disease. This is not an unfortunate consequence. It is a necessary part of the logic of the capitalist system, where profit outweighs human life. The real question, therefore, is not how long to prolong life within capitalism, but how to abolish the system that makes life a commodity. Now we move into international news, where the ongoing protests in Ecuador have again resulted in deadly violence. An indigenous woman died from tear gas, and a farmer is fighting for his life after police operations in Imbabura. Human rights organizations are speaking of escalating repression against demonstrators who have been protesting for weeks against President Daniel Noboa and his economic policies. The nationwide strike in Ecuador claimed another civilian life and left another seriously injured on Wednesday as a result of state oppression. According to human rights organizations and indigenous representatives, there were serious clashes between security forces and demonstrators, particularly in the province of Imbabura. 30-year-old farmer Jose Guaman was initially declared dead after the police crackdown on Tuesday, but later showed signs of life. He is currently in intensive care. Meanwhile, Rosa Paqui Seraquive, an elderly woman from the Quichua Saraguro community, reportedly died of asphyxiation due to the excessive use of tear gas in indigenous areas. The Regional Foundation for Human Rights Consultation and the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador report an increase in police violence in Imbabura and Otavalo. According to a social media post by the Confederation, a wave of people with gunshot wounds, many in critical conditions, have been admitted to Otavalo hospitals. The organization states that soldiers are shooting civilians in residential areas. In an official statement, the Confederation accused the government of Daniel Noboa of turning our communities into war zones and using tear gas, bullets, and indiscriminate violence against the people exercising their constitutional right to protest. Repression and criminalization of indigenous populations have exposed the deep-rooted structural racism in Ecuador's political, media, and social systems, including stigmatizing statements by authorities, acts of cultural humiliation, which have included the forced haircutting of Quichua youth. The protest against the Noboa government began in response to the abolition of diesel subsidies, a measure that caused fuel prices to skyrocket and particularly hit working class and rural populations. What initially began as an economic protest has now developed into a broader social and political uprising. The demonstrators' demands include a reduction in the value-added tax, IVA, from 15% to 12%, increased public investment in health and education, the reduction of government-backed proposal for a constituent assembly, and guarantees to protect indigenous territories from exploitative industries. The focus of the mobilization is in the Sierra and Amazon regions, which have long been considered centers of resistance against the state neglect and ecological exploitation. In more international news, the U.S. has been targeting Latin America. The U.S. government's orders to the CIA for deadly secret operations in the Latin American country constitute a dangerous escalation of war plans against the people of Venezuela and the people of Latin America as a whole, as President Trump openly admitted, adding that the launch of ground strikes is also being considered. It is recalled that for weeks now, the U.S. has been strengthening its forces in the Caribbean, including by deploying 7 warships, while also carrying out a series of deadly strikes against vessels moving in the region, supposedly in the name of combating drug trafficking rings. Responding to a journalist's question, President Trump confirmed that the CIA is now taking action, while also emphasizing that the U.S. is certainly considering taking land as well for new military strikes. Trump tweeted that the Secretary of War ordered a lethal strike on a vessel associated with a designated terrorist organization that traffics drugs in the area of responsibility of U.S. Southcom, that is, the U.S. military command responsible for Latin and Central America, even mentioning that 6 drug traffickers were also killed. This was preceded by indicative statements from the leader of the so-called pro-American opposition in Venezuela, Maria Corina Machado, who was also awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. After defending the action that the U.S. had taken, Machado expressed her concern that the invasion is taking place here is that of Cubans, the Russians, the Iranians, in other words, the opponents of the U.S. and their allies. For its part, the Maduro government ordered military exercises to be held in various regions of Venezuela, describing the deployment of U.S. armed forces in the region as a military threat. Foreign Minister Ivan Gil said that Caracas rejects the warlike and exaggerated statements of the American president, and that we are very diligent about the use of the CIA as well as the deployment of military forces announced in the Caribbean, which constitute a policy of aggression, threat, and harassment against Venezuela. The Venezuelan government announced that military patrols had been deployed in border states such as Táchira and Amazonas. At least 17,000 soldiers have been deployed in Táchira, where 3 key bridges connecting the country to Colombia are located. The U.S. government is also advancing in an intensifying confrontation with forces that do not fully align with U.S. interests and plans in Latin America, while it maintains relations with others, intensifying the arena of competing imperialist centers. Alongside the concentration of U.S. military forces in the southern Caribbean, the arbitrary strikes against ships in the region, the orders and threats for CIA assassination operations and ground strikes in Venezuela, President Donald Trump has also begun targeting Colombia and its government. Previously, Colombian President Gustavo Petro opposed U.S. military strikes in the Caribbean, even speaking of missile attacks against fishermen, in which he claimed one of them lost his life. The Colombian president accused the U.S. of murder, violation of sovereignty, and trying to lay claims to Venezuelan and Guyanese oil. Trump warned that if the Colombian authorities do not take more measures against drug trafficking in the country, the U.S. will do so, and, as Trump said, it will not be done in the best way. Trump has also been expected to announce economic sanctions against Bogotá, while he also spoke of a suspension of U.S. financial aid to Colombia, which he has already begun significantly reducing. Colombian Interior Minister said Trump's comments constituted a threat of invasion or military action against Colombia. The Colombian Foreign Ministry announced that the Colombian ambassador to the U.S. was recalled to Bogotá for consultations and that other decisions taken will be announced in the coming hours. Ironically, President Maduro of Venezuela, in a strikingly social democratic manner, was, until a few days ago, saying that Trump is a pacifist and that Marco Rubio is responsible for American aggression. His counterpart, the Colombian president, Petro, commented that Trump's advisors are supposedly misleading him. In any case, both are stoking illusions and obscuring the root causes from the workers and peoples of Latin America. The CWP USA condemns the military and war plans of U.S. imperialism that are manifesting today in the Caribbean region and in Latin America. We emphasize that we are facing an intra-capitalist and intra-imperialist conflict. The U.S. seeks to reduce the influence of powers such as China and Russia in Latin America, and Venezuela is one of the countries at the center of this confrontation because of its energy resources.
You've been listening to New Worker News on 92.9 FM WZML, your home for local, national, and international news, all from a working class perspective. New Worker News is the official organ of the Communist Workers Platform. If you're a worker, we would like to hear from you. You can reach us at cwpusa@protonmail.com. Again, that's cwpusa@protonmail.com. If you would like more news from a worker's point of view, visit us at newworker.us. You can find weekly articles on events happening all over the country and internationally. If you've enjoyed the program and wish to see more working class reporting, consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/New Worker. And thank you for listening to New Worker News on 92.9 FM WZML.